An important thing for us to consider is also the roles, responsibilities, and the accountability personnel that must be taken into consideration when we are working with a organization and various stakeholders. So it's important to keep in mind that there are many IT processes, and these processes are likely going to have to pass through numerous hands and numerous stakeholders. So when this occurs, sometimes it can go through a number of individuals or a committee for approval. So one example of this could be that you may have a organization that wants to have appropriate governance oversight. And so when this occurs, it's up to that governance oversight to provide for appropriate approvals for the controls and approach for ways in which risks are going to be managed. And then we can also have appropriate management oversight. Now, management oversight is going to be utilized in order to execute the specific rules that are set forth by the governance body. So with this in mind, we can have a governance committee that may, in fact, select a project that can be reviewed by the appropriate governance oversight or management oversight, depending on the terms and conditions. And so some things that we want to keep in mind is that individuals in these roles do not work in isolations. They are going to be supported by appropriate organizational roles. And so these organizational roles are put in place to provide for an appropriate framework that can be utilized to establish the standards for identifying and managing risk. Now, there are going to be 7 domains that we want to work with in regards to a typical IT infrastructure. And so we want to ensure that we have managing access to data to ensure that the complexity of issues are minimized. And data can be sent via emails, it can be in Word documents, it could be transmitted through a file server or server transmission, or it could be through an application that's being used on the system. Regardless of the format of the data, we must keep in mind that data must be understood, analyzed, and protected. And so in order to ensure that we have appropriate protection of our data, we're going to need to have 7 different domains that are going to be associated with our IT infrastructure. So these domains are going to represent various modalities. They can be the roles that are responsible for data quality and handling. And so these roles can include the head of information management, and that's going to be the single point of contact responsible for data quality within the enterprise. It's going to be the data stewards, and the data stewards are going to be responsible for ensuring that data quality is present within the business unit. Then we're also going to have data custodians, and the data custodians are responsible for maintaining the quality of the data. And then we're also going to have our data administrators. The data administrators are going to be responsible for executing the policies and procedures such as the backup, versioning, uploading, downloading, and the database administration approaches. Then we're also going to have appropriate mechanisms that are going to need to be in place for data security administrators. These are going to be responsible for granting access rights, as well as for assessing threats to the information assurance program that's utilized. And so these are different roles that we have to keep into consideration uh, for a typical and IT infrastructure. And so with this in mind, we can also need to keep in mind the organizational structure. And with the organizational structure, this provides us with a lot of insight into how we're able to manage risk specifically, and enables us to provide for mechanisms to put in place how we can prioritize problems that occur. The organizational structure helps us to gain an understanding of how threats will impact the organization and at what levels as well. So in this figure here, we have a organizational depiction of a organization in the private sector. And so we have our executive governance layer, and that layer includes 5 different stakeholder groups. We have our board of directors. You have your audit committee, which communicates directly to the board of directors and the security committee. The executive committee interacts with the security committee as well as the operational risk committee. And so those are going to be the executive governance stakeholders who have oversight for the security process and the actual authority to execute. And so then we also have our operational control group. And with this in mind, it provides for a connection between the executive governance group as well as the operational control group through both the audit committee as well as the security committee. And the audit committee interacts with the security management group, as well as the security committee interacts with the security management group and site security committee that are a part of our operational control group. And so with this case, we have a effective way for the audit committee to deal with audit issues and non-financial risks that are likely to occur. So then we also have our Chief Information Security Officer who can report those issues directly to the audit committee as well. The executive committee is also going to help set priorities. It can remove appropriate roadblocks, as well as provide for appropriate funding for our source authority. And so then we also have to have appropriate communication and interaction between our operational control group. And so this means that we're going to need to have appropriate mechanisms that are in place to ensure that we are able to provide for security operations that can monitor for intrusions and breaches. And so we want to have in place appropriate policies and mechanisms so that team members can effectively and efficiently monitor firewalls, as well as cover network traffic. We want to be sure to understand that when a breach occurs or is discovered, or a breach is discovered, that we're able to activate the incident response team. And so with this in mind, the incident response team is able to respond to breaches and help the business to recover in the most efficient manner possible. So keeping this in place, we can make sure that our vendor management team understands how to manage security concerns with our vendors and our third-party stakeholders. We'll also want to make sure that appropriate data is maintained within the organization. And if a third party needs access, that it's processed appropriately. So with this in case, we can have a theoretical model that can be put into place to provide for support for both leadership and business activities. And so The smoothness of this interaction is going to depend on the number of teams as well as the amount of specialization related to the complexity of the environment and the funding that the organization have. And so the key thing is to keep in mind is that we want to have a organizational framework that is going to provide for agility and a quick way for the organization to respond to any security threats. And so organizational culture has a key influence on this. We want to keep in mind that the organizational culture can influence how IT security policies are implemented. Specifically, this starts with the tone that occurs at the top of the organization. Um, and so we want to ensure we understand how senior leaders are going to deal with the CISO concerns. And so security professionals are gathered and able to gather the threat information and analyze that impact to the organization as well. So this allows for security skills to be mastered and understood. And equally, we want to ensure that we have an appropriate ability to navigate organizational issues and navigate within the organizational culture appropriately. So these can be soft skill components that are needed. And so this can be utilized in order to connect and build trust with the business. If we're not able to build trust, then the IT security team may be viewed as overhead rather than a partner in helping to reduce and mitigate those risks. And so it's important to keep in mind that when working with security professionals, that we don't want to talk strictly in terms of threats. We want to ensure that we have the ability to connect with various lines of business leaders and talk about threats in terms of risk appropriate for the business. So we want to ensure that we're successfully able to deal with the organization's culture and understand how to drive the value to business. So this can take many forms, in the form of us needing to ensure that we have appropriate comprehensive security strategies that are in place in order to help the organization. We want to also keep in mind that we want to have a clear separation of duties. And the separation of duties is a fundamental point of being able to maintain internal control for high-risk transactions. So we want to ensure that we have an underlying framework that supports the separation of duties in a relevant manner. And so we want to have things be layered appropriately. And so a fundamental aspect of that is ensuring that we have layered security approaches for transactional security approaches. And so what we mean by this is if we have a high risk transaction, then we want to separate them between two or more individuals. And so if we have a business unit or vendor account that it's set up and it issues checks for goods that have been received, then we want for that business to have three distinct processes. We need to have it set up the vendor account. We need to have it have appropriate policies for receiving goods. And then we need to have it have the policies for paying that vendor. Having one individual control all three processes can be tricky and can be difficult and can also lead to cutting corners possibly. So in order to avoid this, we want to ensure that we have checks and balances that are in place, This allows for us to reduce the possibility of fraud by making sure that the various transactions are broken up appropriately. So we'll want to have an appropriate domain of responsibility and accountability within our organizational structure. And so with this in place, this allows for us to maintain a separation of our duties. This ensures that we have adequate support to identify any potential opportunities for fraud within the transactions that are being overseen. So applying the separation of duties, we're able to reduce both fraud as well as human errors that are likely to occur. So what we want to do is ensure that we apply the separation of duties across various domains within the organization. And so with this in mind, we can take various approaches. One approach that we could take is the layered security approach. And within the layered security approach, this is going to involve us having 2 or more layers of independent controls that are utilized to reduce risk. So what we want to do is ensure that we're able to leverage the redundancy of those layers. And so if we're able to do that, if one layer fails, then we're able to catch the risk or threat that the next layer should have caught. And so some classic examples of this include, and not necessarily applying only to the transactional level, but we want to separate our high-risk transactions or a combination of transactions between 2 or more appropriate individuals that occur. And so keeping this in mind, we have our separation of duties that are occurring, and this is going to be within our domain of responsibility and accountability. So with management ensuring that we have a key separation between our high-risk transactions, this allows for us to ensure that within a domain, we identify those high-risk transactions and ensure that adequate separation of duties occurs to reduce or minimize any fraud. And so at an organizational level, we want to ensure that no single team is responsible for all 3 tasks associated with designing, implementing, and validating solutions that ensure compliance. And these are the key points that we want to keep in mind when we are focusing on appropriate domains of responsibility and accountability. Next, we'll further discuss some other mechanisms that are in place for defense models to help minimize and reduce